Hello, I hope you're doing quite well, and I'm excited to embark on the journey of assumptions with you. So, learning to question our beliefs as well as those of others. And let's go ahead and dive right in, shall we? So, first and foremost, what are assumptions? I want you to sort of consider that concept and that idea, and while you're thinking about and pulling from what you already know and the reading that you've done, I hope that you come to the conclusion that it is one or more unexamined belief. Uh, and even though this may be a belief that an arguer and an audience share, it's still an assumption. And we'll talk more about that as we continue on momentarily. What do one or more unexamined beliefs look like? So what does that mean? An unexamined belief. And so let's kind of look at these a little bit more independently. It's the act of taking for granted. It's usually a belief that we hold without proof. It's also known as the act of presupposing. So we presuppose something without really having the evidence for that supposition or for that belief. And so it's something that we take for granted. And I want you to think about things in your life, whether it's a tradition, even a family tradition. Assumptions don't have to always be heavy or negative. It can be something simple. But think about things in life. And if you read the announcement and the week at a glance for this week, maybe think about some of the topics presented there as well as in the readings that were assigned for this week. We're going to be identifying all sorts of assumptions. And in order for an other to be constructed, what sort of beliefs are taken for granted without proof? And so our assumptions are also believed to be true. They're assumed to be true in the absence of positive knowledge or evidence to the contrary of them being true. So even though we haven't, and that's why I encourage you to be introspective and look into what your own assumptions are, because these beliefs are things we believe to be true, even though I just said it's an act of taking for granted. It's something that we haven't proven to be true. We don't have proof of it, fact, evidence, so on and so forth, but we still believe it to be true, right? And therefore, our assumptions often go unquestioned. It's usually something that we previously learned or that someone that we trust or see as an authority figure has told us. And so we don't question it and we just take it as being true. Again, in the absence of proof, and it's a belief to be true without positive knowledge to it being true. Sometimes our hidden assumptions are unstated, or our assumptions are hidden or unstated. And what that means is that there will be a claim made, there will be evidence provided, and there will be uh, assumptions that have to be believed in order for that statement to be make sense. And in that sense, it's a hidden or unstated assumption. So our assumptions are not always straightforwardly presented in arguments, and other arguers' arguments aren't always explicitly stating their assumptions. And that's why it's so important for us to be introspective about our own assumptions, why we believe what we believe and how we got there, but also identifying hidden assumptions or unstated assumptions in other people's arguments. Uh, Now, going back to last week's discussion of syllogistic reasoning and syllogistic form, deductive and inductive reasoning using syllogistic form, you want to think about sometimes uh, in arguments, you might have a premise that it ends up being a hidden assumption, that it's not straightforwardly shared, that reason or that premise. Similarly, remember how you were identifying the issue at question or the major claim, conclusion, or thesis statement. Sometimes, remember we talked about how that major claim, conclusion, or thesis statement might be implicit instead of explicitly stated. Well, then it becomes a hidden assumption, right? And meaning that it's unstated or missing. The other thing about our assumptions is that they can be considered true without being validated. So, what we assume to be true based on our sensory input and perceptions, but need to be validated before we can proceed to act upon them. Another thing that I want you to consider is that just like we have different terms in depending upon what sort of discipline you're in or how you're approaching critical thinking or argumentation. We've talked about them for premise, reason, conclusion, thesis, statement. Assumptions are also known as warrants, and we talked about the Toulmin model early on when we talked about argumentation in general. And in the Toulmin model, Toulmin uses warrants for the same thing that we're discussing as assumptions. And so it's very important that we identify, assess, validate, and clarify our assumptions in order to be a strong critical thinker. Because I hope that you're seeing that the depth and the strength of our critical thinking is dependent upon identifying, assessing, validating, and clarifying our assumptions. Similarly, it's really important for us to know how to identify our own assumptions, but we also want to work on identifying others in other arguers' arguments so that we can be absolutely clear in our understanding of where that arguer is coming from and what that arguer is proving. So, what do assumptions do? Well, they help to connect or link the reasons and premises to the claims and conclusions so that a skeptical audience will accept our argument. And once they're identified, these assumptions can help us better understand an argument and where the arguer is coming from. So, in other words, it gives us insight to the argument and the arguer's perspective. And how does it do it? Well, I kind of like Toulmin and his use of warrants because if we think about what a warrant does, something warrants something else. It guarantees something. So if our assumptions warrant or guarantee an argument, that means that the assumption expresses the underlying belief that warrants or guarantees an argument. You can also think of it that assumptions express the value, the belief, or principle that the audience has to hold if the soundness of the argument is to be guaranteed or warranted. So remember with the syllogistic form, and we were talking about deductive reasoning and the conclusion following of necessity from the premises or the reasons. Well, it's these assumptions that also guarantee the logic of the argument. And that's when it becomes problematic, or it becomes problematic when the assumptions are hidden. I really want you to keep this concept in mind, how assumptions express the value, belief, or principle that the audience has to hold if the soundness of the argument is guaranteed or warranted, even if the arguer does not clearly state the assumption. And conversely, it is also representing the assumption that the arguer holds, the belief, the value, the principle that the arguer holds that guarantees the reasons, the premises, what comes forward. So, do we need to identify assumptions? Well, I think this is a really important question. And remember, we've talked in previous discussions about audience and knowing your audience. And part of knowing your audience is knowing what values they hold, what beliefs they hold, what principles they agree to. So if the answer to this really depends. If the audience accepts the unstated and unexamined or hidden assumption, then, or the warrant behind the reason or the premise, then the warrant can safely remain in the background unstated and unexamined. However, if the audience rejects that assumption, doesn't agree with the assumption that guarantees the reason or premise, then we need to take a step back before we can continue forward with our argument and present the reasons. We might need to bring the assumption to the forefront, no longer leave it hidden or unstated, name it, and then prove why that assumption is important and valuable and should be accepted. And then you can go into your argument. I know that this is a little ambiguous right now, but we'll have some examples in a moment that will help to solidify things. The other thing is, we need to ask, are our assumptions always accurate? And if we go with the definition of assumptions that I mentioned earlier, if we assume, right, that our beliefs and worldviews are true, and we use them to interpret the world around us, but it's not always accurate unless we have done the identifying, we've done the assessment and validation and found evidence to prove our assumptions as being valid, then they will be more accurate, right? As a result, it's really important for us to test our assumptions. There are real lessons that can be learned about our critical thinking by addressing and looking into kind of doing a reality test for our assumptions, especially those assumptions under which we typically make our decisions, attempt to solve our problems, attempt to resolve conflicts, and or attempt to relate to other people. So I really, oftentimes inference and assumption are confused. So as a reminder, what's an inference? Well, it's a conclusion about the unknown based upon the known. And it is also an intellectual act by which one concludes that something is true in light of something else as being true or seeming to appear true. And remember, for your essay, you're going to be pulling from some of these terms and defining them and explaining how your authors do or do not use these parts of argumentation, and how, whether or not these parts of argumentation relate to biased or objective reporting, poor journalistic practices, or positive journalistic practices. So let me help you with differentiating between an inference and assumption. So first, if someone comes at me with a knife in her or his hand, I probably would infer that that person means to do me harm. And remember, our inferences can be accurate or inaccurate, logical or illogical, justified or unjustified, right? So I got a little ahead of myself, didn't I? So that's the inference, right? I haven't gotten to the assumption just yet, but that's the inference. And what is an assumption then? Well, it's part of our system of beliefs. It's an intrinsic part of us and the way that we think. And don't forget, it's something that we consider to be true. It's a truth that is taken for granted. So it's something that we take for granted, whether it's true or not. So if we believe that big cities are dangerous at night and we're staying in Chicago, we could infer coming to a conclusion about the unknown based on the known, that it is dangerous to go for a walk late at night. We take for granted our belief, our assumption that it's dangerous to walk late at night in big cities. So notice that the inference is that it's dangerous in Chicago, but we come to that inference because of our assumption, which is our belief about big cities in general, and that big cities are dangerous at night. And so, do you see that if we then make a claim that Chicago is dangerous at night, do you see that that's the inference that leads us to our conclusion upon which we base our claim? But underneath and behind all of that is this hidden assumption about big cities being dangerous. And so if our audience agrees with us that big cities are dangerous, then we can leave that assumption hidden and unstated. But if our audience disagrees with this maybe hasty generalization that is fallacious reasoning, that big cities are not all dangerous, then perhaps then we would need to take a step back before we could talk about Chicago specifically, and we would need to spend some time talking about big cities in general and providing backing. And backing would be the evidence to support that that assumption is valid and true, not just an unverified, invalid belief. So, I think I already mentioned that last bullet point, so I'm going to go on here. So are assumptions sound or unsound? And once again, you're right, it depends on our assumption. If we have a sound belief, we'll have a sound assumption. If we have an unsound belief, then the assumption will not be sound. And again, that relates to is our assumption justified or unjustified? And with some of the topics about othering and constructing the others in our society and assumptions people make or about different people because of their perceived identity or the assumptions that they behave from because of these unstated beliefs, they can be justified or unjustified. Beliefs and hence assumptions can be justified or unjustified depending upon whether or not we have backing and or in the form of reasons and evidence and facts to support them. So consider this example. I'm using a very benign example. I heard a scratch at the door. I got up to let the cat in. What is being inferred? Well, first of all, I'm coming to a conclusion about the unknown based on the known. And I'm coming to the conclusion, my inference is that the cat makes this scratching noise, right? And the inference is based on my assumption, my prior belief that only the cat makes that particular noise and that the cat only makes it when the cat wants to be let in. And so that assumption about certain actions, activities, people, places, and things will inform the inferences and judgments that I make, that we all make, and then also inform the claims that we make, the major claims, the conclusions to which we come to, and our thesis statements. They will also inform the types of evidence that we choose to prove those major claims, conclusions, and or thesis statements. So, is identifying inferences and assumptions significant? I bet you're going to say yes, because why else would I spend so much time going over this with you, right? But we want to think about our assumptions exist because of our beliefs, and our inferences are based on our assumptions. We as humans naturally and regularly use our beliefs as assumptions and make inferences based on those assumptions. And identifying and understanding inferences and assumptions helps us to make sense of our place in the world. Go back to our discussion about worldview. Our worldviews are often based off of our assumptions. If you go back to that presentation, I mentioned it and said we would talk about assumptions later, and here we are, right? Uh, but we must consider and identify inferences and assumptions so that we can make sense of where we are, what we're about, and what's happening, especially as related to argumentation and critical thinking. Uh, Technically, we cannot act without assumptions and inferences. Assumptions and inferences permeate our lives precisely because we cannot act without them. They're just a natural part of how we move through the world. And then ultimately, it's important to identify inferences and assumptions because they influence our conclusions, our judgments, they help us form our interpretations, they help us come to conclusions on the beliefs that we have formed, which also influence our behaviors. And again, thinking about what's happening in the world today, thinking about what the assumptions in the readings, what actions do people make if they're basing their actions on uninformed, invalid, untrue assumptions? Can we see how harm can be caused? Uh, uh, Something to consider and think about. So I want to know what you think about this. Do you agree or disagree? Often different people make different inferences because they bring to situations different viewpoints. They see data differently. To put it another way, uh, people make different assumptions about what they see. For example, going back to or using this, a man is lying in the gutter. What's a possible inference? We're going to come to a conclusion about the unknown based on the known. Well, one, you might be inferring that the man is homeless. Another person may infer that the man is in need of help. Uh, in order to make that claim, in order to come to that conclusion, uh, what assumption must we hold? What belief must we hold in order to make that statement? Well, one assumption for number one might be that only homeless people lie in gutters. No one else. That's the assumption that we're making about people who are hanging out in the gutter. Uh, and then for the second one, uh, only only people in need of help would lie in the gutter. But I don't know about you. When I was a little kid, I was thankfully neither homeless nor in need of help. But I would lie in the gutter and play in the fresh rain water or do, I wouldn't necessarily lie, but you know what I'm saying. And then do the little throw things in it to watch it go rushing down like it was a river. So it again, based on your own experience, based on your own beliefs, values, understanding principles, it will help to inform how you interpret things, your inferences that you make, the judgments that you make, and the conclusions that you make, and then the conclusions upon which you base your arguments. So with assumptions, we must do a few different things. We need to validate and test our assumptions to be sure that they are actually based in reality and that they are factual. When we assume, there's a funny joke, right? You don't ever want to assume because you make an ass out of you and me. And it's humorous, but there's some validity to it, right? We always want to avoid jumping to assumptions, especially if they're negative or illogical. However, for this class, we decided it would be good to assume goodwill, right? That's one time where we're saying the assumption is a positive thing. You don't want to ignore the obvious. If the assumption is hidden, then the argument may not make as much sense. Or we might be able to better refute an argument if we identify the hidden assumption and bring it to the foreground. So you don't want to ignore the assumption, even if you think it's obvious. It could assist you in strengthening your own argument, but it can also assist you in analyzing and refuting other people's arguments. We also want to avoid traps, because we want, if we admit that by taking things for granted, one can fall into the biggest trap of invalidated assumptions, right? And so we have to be careful when we use assumptions, because then we are taking things for granted and we haven't taken the time to validate the conclusions that are based upon our assumptions. We also want to notice the inferences that we're making and what assumptions that they are based off of. Uh, and then we want to acknowledge the assumptions upon which we base those inferences. Uh, and then we want to understand and identify the worldviews that we develop that are based off of our inferences, which come from our assumptions. And then finally, to develop these skills, we need to practice noticing inferences and then figuring out and identifying the assumptions that lead to those inferences. I'm excited for you to spend some time going over the story of an hour and thinking about some of these questions here. There's a lot of assumptions that it's such a neat short story that Kate Chopin wrote. And what's interesting about Kate Chopin is that as a person, she enjoyed a very happy, mutually respectful marriage with her husband. So she was in a healthy marriage that many people might call it healthy. So try not to attribute points of view about marriage to her exactly. The other thing is, people like to call Kate Chopin a feminist author. And although some of her themes with feminist literary criticism, people have really been able to tease out some of the feminist themes, in and of herself, Kate Chopin was not a suffragette. She wasn't a self-proclaimed feminist in that way. Instead, she might have considered herself more a humanist. She was concerned about things that infringed on all people's freedoms. And so when you are evaluating your own assumptions as a reader of this story, as you're making your own inferences and / interpretations of the story, I want you to consider your own assumptions about marriage, but also what assumptions you might be making about Kate Chopin in the telling of this story. The other thing with our last question, the reason I pose this last question is because the doctors have one perspective, but you may or may not agree. And for some of us, you might need to go back and look again at some of the symbols and some of the language that Mrs. Mallard uses, and even to what is she referring when she says things like she feels free? What is she free from? And if she's talking about an excitement and a joy, and what is the irony in the last line that she died of a joy that killed? What's the assumption of what the joy was? Is the joy coming from, oh, my husband's alive and that's what killed her? Or is it coming from something else? Has she seen some freedom? Is some freedom being taken away now that her husband's alive again? So what kind of joy is the joy that kills? So I want you to look closely at some of the assumptions, because that's even leading characters to their own inferences, their own judgments, and their own behaviors as well. Something else, there's a question here about Brentley Mallard. And I want you to think about, even if Mrs. Mallard is dissatisfied in her marriage, some of us might have some assumptions as to what we think would necessitate someone getting out of a marriage. And I want you to consider your own assumptions about that. When we think about divorce or separation, and some people might think if there's mental, emotional, physical abuse, any sort of addiction, there could be a number of different things, right? But look again at what Mrs. Mallard has to say about this. Look again at what she says even about her husband, about his hands and how he treated her, his eyes and how he looked at her, his voice and how he spoke to her. And even think about how she speaks about how she cares about him, and how some of these things might challenge our assumptions about marriage. The audience for which Kate Chopin was writing, their assumptions about marriage, and even the characters within the story and their assumptions about marriage. But ultimately, is Chopin making an argument about the institution of marriage? And are there some lines in the middle, some in the middle of that short story that kind of elucidate for us what those assumptions about marriage are and what those arguments are, the assumptions upon which the arguments are based, and maybe think about some of what's said, that even if people care and are loving toward one another, are they infringing upon another's will? Is marriage as an institution set up in such a way that it infringes on people's independence? So take a look. I can't wait to see more of what you have to say. I'm excited to share a little bit more about the story here with you, and kind of let you think on that a little bit. There are a couple of types of assumptions that we make. We make value assumptions, and they usually come when we have a value conflict. And so values are ideas someone considers to be important, right? And they become, the values are the standards you expect from others. And then ultimately, we have value conflicts, they arise, and that's what leads us to our arguments, right? And to argumentation, and to taking different stances on controversial issues. This happens when two or more values collide. And then we make a value preference, right? And that is when one value is deemed to be more important than the other. And this is how, when you're getting to the parts of your essays where you are addressing the opposition, and when you are either conceding or refuting, as is logical, whatever you're doing in that moment, you always want to bring the argument back to your position, even when you're conceding to an opponent's or the opposition's point. And so what you want to do in that moment is, typically, even though your opposition might say a good point, you're going to come back to the overall goal or purpose of your position. And you might address how, even though that's true, when one looks at this issue in this global way, one sees that this position, whatever your position is on the topic, is the preferred position uh, because of the value, the belief, the principle, right? And so that's one way to assist you with addressing the opposition and bringing back the argument to your own position when you do so. Uh, and so I just want you to recognize that when we have an assumption that is based on a person's value or our own value, we are expressing preferences in what it is, who it is, things that are preferred. So, and please notice how those value preferences and those value assumptions influence our reasoning and the conclusions that we arrive at. Can we also acknowledge that these conflicts in values that are based off of value assumptions, based on values, that this is why, these are the reasons why reasonable people disagree. Maybe think about the extreme polarization of some of the political parties today, and how there are still, even if we don't agree, there are still some reasonable people on both sides. But why there's an inherent value, some assumptions that we hold about what we value, that we just aren't able to reconcile. These value assumptions are also the reasons why we accept or reject an author's argument. When we talk about assumptions as being descriptive, our assumptions sometimes reflect our values, and in other instances, our assumptions reflect our beliefs about how the world is. And so, how do we find descriptive assumptions? Well, mind the gap is referring to look for the gap between the reasons and the conclusions. If we're missing something that's connecting the two, we probably have a hidden assumption, and we need to bring that forward. And that hidden assumption is going to be the thing that describes or explains the belief that must be held in order for that reason to lead to that conclusion. We might also want to identify with the arguer, look through the arguer's lens or the opposition's lens to try to see where they're coming from. And that's all about what essay number 1 was for you, was helping you to understand the stated and hidden assumptions upon which people built their arguments, especially people with whom you disagree. The other thing is we might need to do some research, learn more about the issue, and provide more evidence and facts to help support our descriptive assumptions. And then ultimately, we need to identify those beliefs. Consider what an arguer might believe in order for that arguer's reasoning to make sense. So, with this piece, I'm going to let you go ahead and read through it for a moment. And essentially, what I want to ask are, what are some of the assumptions in this passage? And some are value assumptions and some are descriptive assumptions. And so maybe pause for a second so you can read through this on your own and then restart it after you've given it some thought. And I keep talking, hoping that you're reading through it right now. But I hope that you see a couple of things. What is being valued? In order for the arguments to be made here, that is being made here, in order for the evidence that's being presented to be presented here, what must be some of the value assumptions? So before we get there, we might even want to identify what's the issue at question. And if I asked you to put that into the question, perhaps you would say, what is a way that housewives can cope or deal with stress? And you can see that this might be a little outdated argument because amphetamines aren't really being used quite so much, but I think it still works. And then what's the conclusion? Well, the conclusion is that housewives can take amphetamines, right? It certainly seems preferable to have women taking amphetamines than to have them experiencing massive nervous breakdowns. So something along that lines would be the conclusion, the major claim, or the thesis statement. What are some of the reasons? Well, if you look through, it gives energy and peace of mind. It's rarely addictive, not expensive, prevents nervous breakdown. I'm not going to take time to evaluate each one of those right now, but you'll be doing that in your critical thinking worksheet coming up, and you've practiced doing it last week as well. But I would encourage you to look at each of those things. In terms of ambiguous terms or phrases, is moderate for you may be a lot for me. Moderate for me may be a lot for you. So what are moderate doses? What about not very expensive? What does that mean? And how, that's a very relative term, right? How about effective? What are we determining is effective or not? And little evidence. What does little evidence mean to suggest? And what if that little evidence is really significant evidence, right? And if we're thinking about fallacies, is that an appeal to ignorance in that way? And relative, if there's, I forget exactly where it is, but relative to what, right? Now, there's a value assumption, things that are valued here, right? Well, one thing that might be a positive is valuing housewives and their stress levels. There's an assumption that it's important, the mental health of housewives is important, right? So that's a value assumption. And in order for us to have this argument, we have to acknowledge that that's one of the assumptions. Now, if people were to disagree with this argument or parts of that assumption, we might need to spend some time providing some backing to explain why we should value the mental health of housewives. So go back to the earlier discussion when we were defining assumptions, and here's an example of when we might need to pull that hidden assumption forward and maybe even provide some backing and evidence to prove that assumption. Maybe the numbers of women who suffer mental health, their mental health suffers from stress levels. And in fact, currently with the pandemic, there's a lot of evidence that's showing that women, wives, mothers are taking on a lot of extra stress during this pandemic. So that could be something that could be evidence to help prove that. Another value assumption is that it's good to take drugs, right? If there's something going wrong, that it's a positive thing, that it's a healthy thing, it's an acceptable thing to take drugs to help remedy issues related to stress levels or mental health. And do you see that in order to say that they should take amphetamines, that's the hidden assumption behind that reason, right? And you could see also, depending upon people's worldviews or people's values when it comes to being holistic or taking drugs or putting chemicals in their bodies, that might be another hidden assumption or warrant that might need to be brought to the forefront and provided a little bit more explanation or evidence. And that's the form of backing that we talked about before. There are also a couple of descriptive assumptions here. And it's describing, remember, it's a belief about how the world is. Look at some of the reasons, look at some of the claims, look at some of the reasoning, and notice that there's these assumptions, these hidden assumptions, this belief, descriptive assumption, beliefs about how the world is, in terms of there's no talk of it. Nobody's allergic to the drugs, right? There are no side effects to the drugs. There are also no alternatives to the drugs. There's also a belief about housewives that they would have a desire to use medicinal aids and to take the drugs in this way to assist them. So hopefully this helps you to see more practically how assumptions work and the significance of identifying them. And then here is another sort of, this, you can see it's a little bit old, but I think it's a good example about we've got some facts, we've got some inferences, we've got some judgments, and we certainly have some assumptions. And there are some assumptions about when we look about who behaved how. According to authorities, the wrestler asphyxiated Nancy and Daniel before hanging himself. Federal investigators have not determined a possible motive, but they report that steroids were found at the scene. Is there an assumption about steroid use being a hidden assumption about steroid use being an impetus for this violent behavior? And when you have the extra information about investigators claiming that the doctor prescribed 10 times the normal amount of steroids, are we having some value assumptions being made as well in terms of what may have been the cause for the wrestler's behavior? So Okay, so go forth and consider what assumptions lead you to your inferences, influence your worldviews, and make you consider and inform the way that you behave. So I thought I would take another few minutes to assist you with one of the uh, activities that you're going to be doing. And so you have been asked to analyze a bumper sticker, right? And I hope you enjoy bumper stickers as much as I do. I'm opening up my uh, the discussion board so I can look at it and know exactly what I've asked you to do for this week. But I hope you enjoy reading people's bumper stickers as much as I do. I always find it fascinating. And then also, I hope you enjoy this activity as well. So first, you're going to want to look at your bumper sticker. And for our example here, I don't know if this is backward for you or not. It looks backward to me, but hopefully it's the right way forward for you, but I'll read it. It says, if only closed minds came with closed mouths. And it has duct tape over somebody's mouth, and we see a human face, right? With that duct tape and that statement said there. Now, so first and foremost, you're asked, who do you think the intended audience is? And so what I would encourage you to do is look at the colors, look at the focal point, think about all the things that you read about and discussed about last week in terms of visual rhetoric and analyzing visuals. And so look at the placement of things. It's sepia tone, which is interesting because it's such a dichotomous sort of statement that, but it's not in black and white, right? It's more sepia tone colors. And you may be able to try to identify some sort of gender from whose face this is on, but because it's so vague and unclear, to me, I think it's really the audience is pretty broad and it's dealing with humanity and human beings because the minds is more general, mouths is more general, and we can't pinpoint necessarily any sort of um, race, ethnicity, uh, gender, sexuality, anything, right? So I think it's all inclusive of all people. Um, so that's what I would go with the audience here. Next, and then notice if I were writing this out, I would explain and share my evidence from the sticker like I just did for you verbally. I would share that to prove what I'm saying about the audience. Next, what's the implicit argument? Because there is an argument, right? And so I want you to think about that. And is it implicit, explicit? Sometimes it's more explicit than others. But if only closed minds came with closed mouths. So is this argument, would the major claim, conclusion, or thesis statement be that people need to be open-minded, and only open-minded people should be speaking up? Could that be a possible argument that this is saying? Uh, because it is asking it is sort of posing the question in a conditional if only closed minds came with closed mouths. So it's not a straight up claim, but can we see that that's the implied argument, right? That the implied argument is closed-minded people should stay quiet and open-minded people should speak up. It's a little ironic though, isn't it? Because if this person who is showing this bumper sticker, if it's on this person's vehicle, what's the assumption we might make about the person who's putting this forward? Because this person would obviously think, and let's just call it the speaker or the arguer, who would be hosting this and putting this forward, obviously thinks him, her, themselves to be an open-minded person, right? But by encouraging people to close their mouth, is that being open-minded? So there's some irony in here, right? And again, it's supposed to be a little humorous, so hopefully there's humor too. Now, what are the hidden assumptions? There are hidden assumptions. I just talked about some of the assumptions, right? But also some other, in order for someone to say this, there's a value assumption of people with open minds are valued more than people with closed minds. There's also a descriptive assumption, a belief about how the world is. If we need to close the mind, close the mouths of closed minded people, does that mean that the descriptive assumption is that a lot of closed minded people are being very vocal and very loud and speaking up quite a bit? So I think those would be the major two, one value and one belief assumption that I would say. But then also, we might infer some things based on our assumptions about the arguer, her, him, themselves, right? So essentially, I've just modeled for you what you're going to be doing with your bumper sticker analysis. And I strongly encourage you to also look at your colleagues' responses and what bumper stickers they had so that you can sort of see what other people are doing with and how they're identifying assumptions. So I hope you have a great week. Thank you for taking time and looking this over, and I look forward to communicating with you soon. Take care.